What if I told you that the very idea of a nation's future led to wars, broken treaties, and the destruction of entire cultures? What if that same belief justified the loss of thousands of lives, the erasure of identities, and the reshaping of a continent? A belief that said some people were destined to control the land, and others were destined to vanish. This was the driving force behind Manifest Destiny, a vision that changed the course of history and whose consequences are still being felt today. But did America's destiny come at a price too great to ignore? The cost of progress is more than you've been told. Stick with me because by the end you'll see how this story still haunts America's soul. In the early 1800s, America was a young nation, still finding its footing in the world. It had recently gained independence from Britain and was recovering from the wounds of war. But there was a restless energy stirring beneath the surface, a powerful belief that the country's future was destined for greatness, that it had a mission unlike any other. This belief would not only shape the fate of the United States, but would alter the course of history itself. That belief was known as Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny was more than just an idea. It was a force that drove America to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific, all in the name of a divine right to conquer and civilize. Coined in 1845 by the journalist John L. O'Sullivan, the term was meant to capture a vision that had already taken root in the minds of many Americans. O'Sullivan argued that the U.S. was destined by God to stretch its borders across the continent, bringing democracy and civilization to the wild lands of the West. But was this belief truly a noble cause? Or was it, in fact, an excuse to justify conquest, violence, and the destruction of entire cultures? As America's borders expanded, millions were displaced, countless lives were lost, and the nation's idea of its divine right led to bloodshed that is still felt today. At the heart of it all lies a question that's still debated today. Was Manifest Destiny the birth of the American dream, or the beginning of a nightmare for those who stood in its way? To understand the full impact of this vision, we need to go back to its roots, to a time when a young nation hungry for land and power believed it was destined to rule over a continent. The story of Manifest Destiny is not just one of expansion, but of ambition, destruction, and a deep conflict that would shape America's future in ways no one could have foreseen. So how did a belief in destiny become one of the most controversial forces in American history? Let's find out. What exactly is Manifest Destiny? To truly understand the force behind Manifest Destiny, we first need to define it. The term Manifest Destiny was coined in 1845 by the journalist John L. O'Sullivan, but the idea it represented had been brewing for years before that. O'Sullivan argued that it was America's divine right, even God-given responsibility, to expand across the North American continent. To him, the United States wasn't just a young nation, it was a nation with a mission. And that mission was to stretch from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. But why did so many Americans believe this was their destiny? The early 1800s were a time of enormous change. The United States, still recovering from the War of 1812 with Great Britain, was expanding its borders and population at an astonishing rate. Economically, it was still a young nation, struggling with things like national debt and a growing population in the East. But Americans had a restless energy. They wanted land, they wanted opportunity, and they wanted influence. And crucially, they believed they were destined to have it. This belief in expansion wasn't just about geography. It was tied to a deep sense of cultural superiority. Many Americans, especially those of European descent, felt they had a moral obligation to spread their way of life. They believed that their democracy, Christian values, and ideas of civilization were superior to the barbaric and savage ways of the people already living in the territories they wanted to claim. In this mindset, westward expansion wasn't simply about gaining new land. It was about a moral mission to tame the wilderness. To many, this meant spreading democracy and Christianity across the vast, untamed territories. It was seen as America's responsibility to bring civilization to the native tribes and lands they viewed as backward or uncultivated. But this wasn't just a religious or cultural belief, it was also political. Manifest destiny quickly became more than an ideal. It became a movement. Politicians and public figures began to adopt the idea as a justification for territorial expansion. The notion was spread far and wide, reaching even the halls of power in Washington, where it helped fuel major decisions about annexing Texas, acquiring Oregon, and even going to war with Mexico. It was a belief that touched on every part of American life, from economic policy to military action to the very identity of the nation. Americans were motivated by economic opportunity as well. The promise of fertile land in the West, especially in areas like California and Oregon, attracted settlers eager for new chances. This land, often obtained through treaties or war, was seen as a fresh start, a way to escape the crowded, industrialized East and begin a new life. So, what exactly did this manifest destiny mean in practical terms? For one, it meant displacing entire populations to make room for settlers. Native Americans were seen as obstacles in the way of this grand vision. The expansion of the United States didn't just bring more territory, it brought the destruction of native cultures, the forcing of tribes onto reservations, and, in many cases, violence. It was a belief that justified pushing aside anyone who stood in the way of progress. But manifest destiny was not without its critics. Some Americans questioned whether it was morally right to expand at the expense of others. Others feared that the spread of slavery into new territories would further divide the country. And yet, despite these objections, manifest destiny continued to influence American policies for decades. It became clear that westward expansion wasn't just about land, it was about power, culture, and control. The belief in manifest destiny shaped the way America saw itself on the world stage and set the stage for a nation that would stretch across a continent. But was it all a grand vision of a better future, or was it a rationalization for conquest and the subjugation of others? In the end, the question remains. Was manifest destiny truly a divine calling, or was it simply a way for America to justify its ambition at any cost? The idea of manifest destiny, the belief in America's divinely ordained right to expand, was about to face a harsh reality. That reality came in the form of the Mexican-American War, a conflict that would not only change the map of North America, but would also intensify the moral and political divisions within the United States. All of it started with one goal: the desire for more land. By the mid-1840s, the United States had already gained control over much of the territory east of the Mississippi. But to truly fulfill the vision of manifest destiny, the country needed the vast lands in the West, including Texas, California, and the Southwest. These territories were rich in resources, fertile land, and access to the Pacific, ideal for the growing nation. The first step in this ambitious expansion was the annexation of Texas in 1845. Texas had fought its own revolution against Mexico in the 1830s, declaring itself an independent republic. But when Texas asked to join the U.S., Mexico saw this as an act of aggression, and tensions flared. Mexico had never formally recognized Texas's independence, and the U.S. now wanted to incorporate it into the Union. The Mexican government was furious. But annexing Texas was only the beginning. The United States also had its eyes on California and the Southwest, territories that were part of Mexico. President James K. Polk, a strong proponent of manifest destiny, pushed for the annexation of these regions, even if it meant war. Polk's administration was determined to expand westward, but Mexico wasn't going to give up its land easily. In the winter of 1845, tensions reached a boiling point when the U.S. moved troops into disputed territories along the Rio Grande River, claiming the area as part of Texas. The Mexican government viewed this as an invasion. When a skirmish broke out, Polk seized on the incident, calling it an attack on American soil, and the U.S. declared war on Mexico in April of 1846. The Mexican-American War was not a brief conflict. It would last for nearly 2 years and be fought on multiple fronts, with both sides suffering significant losses. The war would take the lives of over 13,000 Americans, while thousands more were wounded. On the Mexican side, the death toll was even higher, but the effects would be felt long after the fighting stopped. One of the war's key moments came in 1847 during the Battle of Veracruz, one of the first major battles of the war. U.S. forces, led by General Winfield Scott, launched a daring amphibious assault on the Mexican port city of Veracruz, which was heavily defended. After intense fighting, the city fell to the Americans, allowing them to march inland toward Mexico City. This victory marked a turning point in the war and demonstrated the might of the U.S. military. Meanwhile, General Zachary Taylor led U.S. forces in the north, winning key battles at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. These victories helped pave the way for the capture of Monterrey in northern Mexico. Taylor's successes on the battlefield would later make him a national hero, and in 1848, he would be elected President of the United States. However, the cost of this victory was staggering. Beyond the lives lost, the war left deep political scars within the United States. The acquisition of vast new territories, including modern-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, sparked fierce debates over the future of slavery in these areas. Would slavery expand with the new territories? The U.S. was deeply divided along regional lines, and the tensions created by the war would eventually lead to the Civil War in 1861. But perhaps the most controversial question of all was whether the war was a noble mission to fulfill America's manifest destiny, or whether it was an act of imperial conquest. Critics, including prominent figures like Henry David Thoreau, saw the war as an unjust grab for power. Thoreau famously refused to pay taxes in protest, writing his essay, Civil Disobedience, which would later inspire many civil rights movements. Others saw the war as a dark chapter in the story of manifest destiny. It was a land grab, justified by the belief that the U.S. was destined to expand, no matter the cost. While some saw it as fulfilling America's rightful place in the world, others saw it as a violation of international law and human rights. The end of the war came in 1848, with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. In the treaty, Mexico ceded over half of its territory to the United States, which became known as the Mexican Cession. In exchange, the U.S. agreed to pay $15 million and assume the responsibility for Mexican debts. The treaty solidified the U.S.'s claim to Texas and the territories it had fought for. But at what cost? While the war resulted in a new chapter of American expansion, it left behind a bitter legacy. Over 13,000 Americans died, but many more, on both sides, were left to deal with the political, moral, and social ramifications. The debate over whether the U.S. had the right to claim these lands by force would continue for decades, and the war's aftermath would sow the seeds of further division within the country. So, was the Mexican-American War a victory for American destiny? Or was it an imperial conquest dressed in the cloak of righteousness? The answer lies in the consequences it set in motion, for both the United States and Mexico, and for the countless lives it affected. The displacement of Native Americans. While manifest destiny was about the growth and expansion of the United States, its promise of a bright future came at a devastating cost. That cost was borne by the very people who had lived on this land for centuries, the Native American tribes. As settlers pushed westward and the United States expanded its borders, thousands of Native Americans were forced off their ancestral lands, and their cultures were nearly erased from history. The forced relocation and brutality they endured is a chapter in American history that is both painful and often overlooked. The year was 1830, and President Andrew Jackson, a strong proponent of manifest destiny, signed the Indian Removal Act into law. This legislation authorized the forced relocation of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands in the Southeast to lands west of the Mississippi River, an area that was known as Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma. But what was sold as a benevolent policy to protect Native Americans from the advancing white settlers quickly turned into one of the darkest chapters of American history. The Indian Removal Act was justified by the belief that Native Americans were in the way of progress. To many, they were seen as savages, a people who needed to be removed in order for American civilization to grow and expand. The idea was simple. The land they lived on was needed for farming, mining, and settlement, and the United States had a divine right to it. But the people who had lived there for centuries, Cherokee, Choctaw, Seminole, and dozens of other tribes, were treated as obstacles to be removed, not as sovereign nations with their own cultures, rights, and histories. The Trail of Tears is perhaps the most well-known and heart-wrenching result of the Indian Removal Act. Between 1831 and 1838, approximately 100,000 Native Americans were forcibly relocated from their homelands in the Southeast. The Cherokee, one of the largest and most sophisticated tribes in the region, fought back in the courts, even winning a Supreme Court case in Worcester versus Georgia that declared their sovereignty. But President Jackson refused to enforce the court's decision, and the Cherokee were forced to march hundreds of miles to Oklahoma, facing hunger, disease, and exposure. The Trail of Tears was nothing short of a death march. Out of the 15,000 Cherokee who were forced to relocate, nearly 4,000 died from disease, starvation, and exhaustion. It wasn't just the Cherokee who suffered. The Choctaw were the first to be forcibly moved in 1831, and their journey to the west was equally deadly. An estimated one-third of the Choctaw population perished during the move. The Seminole in Florida also resisted removal, leading to the Second Seminole War, a brutal conflict that lasted 7 years and resulted in the deaths of many Seminole people. The toll on Native American communities wasn't just physical. The cultural devastation was profound. For generations, Native tribes had lived in harmony with the land, with rich traditions, languages, and spiritual practices tied to their ancestral territories. The forced removal tore these communities apart, displacing families, disrupting spiritual practices, and breaking the social fabric that had held tribes together for centuries. The U.S. government sold the idea of opening up the land to settlers as a blessing. They promised it would bring economic prosperity to the nation. But the government ignored the suffering that would come at the expense of the indigenous people who had called the land home for thousands of years. This wasn't just about land. It was about the destruction of cultures. Thousands of children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools where they were forced to abandon their native languages, religions, and traditions. The Choctaw, Cherokee, and Seminole were just a few examples of tribes that were impacted by this policy. Entire nations were uprooted from their lands. The Osage, Pequot, and Chickasaw faced similar fates, with many losing their traditional ways of life and becoming dependent on government provisions. As settlers poured into the newly opened lands, the native tribes were reduced to smaller, less fertile reservations, where their survival was often dependent on the government's inconsistent support. The forced relocation, violence, and cultural destruction were not just isolated events. They were the price of manifest destiny, the belief that America's future was destined to come at the expense of the native populations. The government's justification that Native Americans were in the way of progress allowed the brutality of the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears to occur with little opposition. And the suffering didn't end with the removal. The scars of manifest destiny are still visible today in Native American communities. The fight for sovereignty, land rights, and cultural preservation continues as many tribes work to reclaim their ancestral lands and rebuild their cultures. The legacy of the Trail of Tears is one of deep trauma, loss, and a painful reminder of the cost of unchecked ambition. What we call the settling of the West was not a peaceful process. It was an invasion of land, a destruction of cultures, and a loss of life on a scale that is hard to fully comprehend. And for the Native Americans who were displaced, their fight to survive and to preserve their way of life remains an ongoing battle, even as the memory of those lost to manifest destiny fades further into history. As the United States expanded westward in pursuit of its manifest destiny, it was not just the lives and cultures of Native Americans that were disrupted. The land itself, rich with diverse ecosystems, was also subjected to tremendous strain. The pursuit of wealth, resources, and land for settlement and industry led to profound environmental and economic changes, many of which would have lasting, often devastating consequences. One of the most catastrophic consequences of westward expansion was the destruction of the buffalo population. For thousands of years, the buffalo was central to the lives of Native American tribes. It provided food, shelter, clothing, and tools. The vast herds of buffalo roaming the plains were not only an iconic symbol of the American frontier, but a crucial part of the ecosystem. But as settlers moved west, driven by the promise of fertile land and riches, they brought with them new industries and technologies that would begin the decimation of the buffalo. It wasn't just hunting for food, it was organized commercial hunting, driven by the fur trade and the demand for buffalo hides for clothing, wagon covers, and even industrial purposes. By the mid-1800s, buffalo were being slaughtered at an alarming rate. The railroads played a significant role in this destruction. Trains, once seen as the epitome of progress and civilization, were now part of the problem, as they made it easier for hunters to track and kill buffalo in massive numbers. In the end, over 30 million buffalo were killed, leaving only a small fraction of the population behind by the late 1800s. The collapse of the buffalo population led directly to the collapse of the Native American economy. Many tribes, including the Lakota Sioux and the Cheyenne, depended on buffalo for survival. Without this critical resource, their way of life was no longer sustainable. The United States government's policies toward Native Americans not only displaced them from their lands, but also systematically destroyed the very foundation of their economy and culture. While the human cost of westward expansion was painfully clear, the environmental toll was equally severe. As settlers arrived, they began to clear vast swaths of forest and grasslands, converting them into farmland, towns, and cities. The Homestead Act of 1862, which offered 160 acres of land to any settler willing to farm it, accelerated this process. The act promised new opportunities to many Americans, but it also meant the destruction of the very ecosystems that had supported native populations for generations. The Homestead Act was one of the key policies driving westward expansion. While it opened up land to settlers, it also led to the destruction of vast tracts of native forests and prairies. The land, once teeming with wildlife, was turned into farmland, with monocultures of wheat and corn replacing the diverse ecosystems that had existed for centuries. The government promised settlers free land, but at what cost? The destruction of natural resources, the depletion of fertile soils, and the displacement of wildlife were all consequences of this land rush. By the time the Homestead Act was fully implemented, millions of acres of Native American land had been lost to settlers. But it wasn't just farming that was reshaping the environment. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, was another powerful symbol of progress, connecting the eastern U.S. to the western frontier. It was supposed to bring economic prosperity, but it also left its own environmental and social scars. The Transcontinental Railroad was the greatest engineering marvel of the 19th century. It allowed goods and people to move across the country faster than ever before, helping to open up the western markets. But the building of the railroad also meant the destruction of even more natural habitats, as it cut through mountains, forests, and plains. Entire ecosystems were upended to make way for the iron tracks. The railroad did more than just alter the land. It brought with it new economic forces, such as the demand for timber, coal, and metals, that would devastate the environment. Deforestation, overhunting, and the pollution caused by the railroads began to take a significant toll on wildlife and natural resources. The railroad also made it easier to transport cattle, increasing the pressure on the buffalo population even more. While the environmental costs were high, the economic incentives behind these policies were clear. For many, the expansion of the railroad, coupled with the promise of cheap land and agricultural opportunity, seemed like a chance for a better life. Mining towns boomed as precious minerals like gold, silver, and copper were discovered in the West. These minerals would fuel America's industrial revolution, bringing great wealth to some, but at the cost of land and lives for others. Mining companies also began to clear large swaths of land, often using destructive techniques like hydraulic mining, which washed away entire mountainsides in search of gold. The environmental devastation in places like California and Nevada was immense, leaving scars that still persist today. But the economic promises of Manifest Destiny weren't without their contradictions. As much as the government sought to open up the West to settlers and industries, the reality was that indigenous populations were forcibly removed, and the environment was irrevocably altered. The expansion didn't just change the landscape, it reshaped the entire economy and society. And while some Americans prospered, many Native Americans and the environment paid the ultimate price. In the end, the environmental and economic costs of Manifest Destiny were far greater than what most Americans at the time could have ever imagined. The land was opened up for progress, but at the expense of ecosystems, indigenous ways of life, and the balance of nature that had existed for centuries. The price of this so-called progress still resonates today. The expansion of the United States under the banner of Manifest Destiny wasn't just driven by a desire for land and resources. It was also underpinned by a dangerous belief in racial superiority. At the core of Manifest Destiny was the idea that Americans, particularly white Americans, were exceptional, and that their dominance over other races was justified. This sense of American exceptionalism wasn't just a political or cultural belief. It was an ideology that shaped policies, justified atrocities, and ultimately led to one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history. At its heart, Manifest Destiny was more than a territorial ambition. It was a belief that the United States had a divine mission to spread its values of democracy, liberty, and Christianity across the continent. But these values were often defined by a very narrow, racially exclusive lens. Many Americans believed that white settlers, particularly those of European descent, were racially superior to Native Americans, Mexicans, and African slaves. This racial hierarchy justified not only the displacement of indigenous people, but also the expansion of slavery into new territories. Figures like Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, and James K. Polk were champions of Manifest Destiny, and their words and actions reflected the deeply ingrained belief in white supremacy. Jefferson, in particular, spoke of the United States as a chosen nation, a land destined for white settlers to dominate. Jackson, a key proponent of Indian removal and westward expansion, viewed Native Americans as obstacles to this divine mission, believing that their cultures needed to be wiped out in favor of American values. Jefferson famously wrote, "I view the American Revolution as a revolution in favor of human liberty and universal rights, except, of course, for the Native Americans and enslaved Africans." His vision of liberty was for a select group, and this exclusion was a key factor in the ideological foundation of Manifest Destiny. This belief in racial superiority fed into the expansion of slavery, especially in the newly acquired territories of Texas and California. As the U.S. gained vast new lands through wars like the Mexican-American War, it became clear that the question of whether slavery would expand into these new territories would be central to the nation's future. Slavery was not just an economic system in the South. It became a political weapon used by pro-slavery factions to justify the expansion of U.S. territory. The idea of expanding slavery into the territories was directly tied to the economic interests of the South, where the economy was built on slave labor, particularly in cotton and tobacco farming. For Southern slaveholders, the expansion of slavery was not just about preserving their way of life, it was about maintaining their economic dominance. And as the United States expanded westward, they wanted to ensure that the newly acquired territories, such as Texas, Oregon, and California, would become slave states. The tension over the future of slavery came to a head with the Compromise of 1850, a series of laws intended to address the status of territories acquired in the wake of the Mexican-American War. The compromise allowed for the admission of California as a free state, but it also introduced the Fugitive Slave Act, which required northern states to return runaway slaves to their owners in the South. It was a compromise, but one that satisfied neither side. The Compromise of 1850 was supposed to calm tensions between North and South, but it did anything but. It inflamed the issue of slavery, leading to more violent clashes. The Fugitive Slave Act, in particular, was seen as an affront by abolitionists in the North, who saw it as a direct violation of human rights. Meanwhile, the South was enraged by the loss of potential new slave states, particularly with California's admission as a free state. Stick with me, because by the end, you'll see how this story still haunts America's soul. This tension boiled over into violence, most notably in Bleeding, Kansas. Under the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, the people of Kansas and Nebraska were allowed to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery based on the idea of popular sovereignty. What followed was a brutal civil war between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces, with violent skirmishes and massacres erupting across Kansas. Hundreds died in what became known as Bleeding, Kansas. The violence in Kansas was a direct consequence of the belief that America's future was built on racial superiority. The idea that white Americans were destined to expand and dominate meant that there was no place for people of different races, whether they were Native Americans, African Americans, or Mexicans. This belief did more than just justify westward expansion. It created the conditions for a civil war. The ideological divide over slavery, spurred by the racial justifications behind Manifest Destiny, would lead directly to the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. The expansion of the U.S. had not only reshaped the land, it had exposed the deep moral rifts between North and South. The debate over whether slavery would extend into the new territories would shape the destiny of the United States for decades to come. And it all started with the belief in American exceptionalism and the notion that the U.S. had the right to spread its values, no matter the cost. The impact of Manifest Destiny didn't end with territorial expansion. The ideology that fueled it, racial superiority, American Manifest Destiny's long-lasting legacy. Though Manifest Destiny may have been an idea of the 19th century, its echoes still reverberate through modern American politics and culture. The belief in American exceptionalism, the idea that the U.S. is uniquely destined to lead the world, has not only shaped the country's history, but continues to inform its actions on the global stage. The same ideology that once justified the expansion of U.S. territory across North America now influences foreign policy, military interventions, and the nation's sense of its place in the world. In the 21st century, the legacy of Manifest Destiny can be seen in the way America approaches its role on the world stage. The idea of a nation destined for greatness is still a powerful force behind American foreign policy. This belief has justified military interventions and the expansion of U.S. influence far beyond its borders. Some critics argue that modern-day actions, like the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, echo the same expansionist ideology that drove the U.S. across North America in the 19th century. Take, for example, the U.S. military presence in the Middle East. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have been seen by some as a continuation of the belief in America's right to spread democracy and reshape the world in its image. Just as Americans once believed that expanding westward was a mission to bring civilization, the modern notion of nation-building in foreign lands carries echoes of the same sense of destiny, that the U.S. has a responsibility to intervene and fix the world's problems, often at the expense of the people in those regions. This mindset of American exceptionalism has led to significant consequences, both abroad and at home. The idea that the U.S. is the world's moral compass has often been questioned, particularly when its actions have led to destabilization, loss of life, and unintended consequences. Just as manifest destiny justified the displacement of Native Americans, modern-day interventions are sometimes seen as a form of neo-imperialism, a pursuit of power masked as a mission to spread freedom. But the legacy of manifest destiny isn't just felt in foreign policy. It's still very much alive in the struggles of Native Americans, whose land, rights, and cultures were devastated by the expansion of the U.S. in the 1800s. Today, Native American tribes continue to fight for land rights, sovereignty, and the preservation of their cultures, much of which was taken from them during the era of manifest destiny. The fight for land is a key issue for many Native American communities today. In recent years, oil pipelines, such as the Dakota Access Pipeline, have become flashpoints for the struggle to protect indigenous lands. These pipelines, which run through sacred Native American territories, have led to widespread protests, with tribal members and allies demanding that the government respect Native sovereignty and protect the environment. While the United States made promises in treaties with Native American nations, those promises were often broken. Many Native tribes continue to fight for recognition of the land they once inhabited, and are still working to secure the rights to the land they were pushed onto in the 19th century. These land struggles are a direct result of the legacy of manifest destiny, where the U.S. justified its expansion by displacing Native peoples and breaking its commitments to them. Native American communities are also dealing with the consequences of historical trauma. Cultural preservation remains a significant challenge, as languages, traditions, and ceremonies are at risk of being lost forever. The destruction of sacred lands and the ongoing fight for tribal sovereignty highlight how deeply manifest destiny's expansionist mindset continues to affect Native American communities. Despite being recognized as sovereign nations in theory, many tribes still struggle for political autonomy and basic human rights. The ongoing struggles of Native Americans for self-determination and cultural preservation are a testament to the lasting impact of manifest destiny. Though the U.S. expanded its borders, it never fully addressed the injustices suffered by Native peoples. Instead, these injustices continue to shape the lives of Native Americans today, from land disputes to political representation. And it's not just the land that was lost. It's the very idea of belonging. Manifest destiny taught that some peoples and cultures were destined to be part of the American experiment, while others were viewed as expendable. That belief didn't end with westward expansion. It became a foundational idea that shaped how America viewed its indigenous peoples and, by extension, how it viewed those outside its borders. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of manifest destiny is the idea of the United States as a global power, one that is destined to lead, intervene, and shape the future of the world. Whether it's through military force or diplomatic influence, the idea that the U.S. is a beacon of freedom echoes the same exceptionalist mentality that fueled westward expansion. The expansionist mindset, once used to justify the destruction of indigenous cultures, is now used to justify American interventionism, especially in regions like the Middle East, where the U.S. has taken on a self-appointed role as the enforcer of peace and democracy. From the displacement of Native Americans to the intervention in foreign nations, the legacy of manifest destiny is a reminder that ideas of power, dominion, and exceptionalism come at a cost. The expansion of U.S. territory in the 1800s set a dangerous precedent, one that continues to shape American politics and global relations today. The price of this belief in manifest destiny has been paid by indigenous peoples, both at home and abroad, and the consequences of those actions will echo for generations to come. Manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined by God to expand across the continent, was a force that reshaped the future of America. It led to the birth of the nation as we know it today, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, with wealth, power, and influence at its fingertips. But while manifest destiny led to the creation of the modern United States, it also left behind deep scars that are still felt today. The land we now call home was won through violence, displacement, and the destruction of entire cultures. The cost of that expansion was far greater than the U.S. was ever willing to acknowledge. As we've seen, the consequences of manifest destiny were not just political, they were human. The belief in America's divine right to expand led to the forced relocation of Native American tribes, the violence of the Mexican-American War, and the destruction of the buffalo that were essential to Native economies. Entire cultures were wiped out in the name of progress, and the displacement of Native peoples set the stage for a century of struggle over land, rights, and identity. For Native Americans, the expansion of the U.S. wasn't just a loss of land. It was the loss of everything: culture, language, traditions, and livelihoods. Entire communities were erased from the map, and their descendants continue to fight for justice, land, and cultural survival today. But the human cost wasn't limited to Native Americans. The Mexican-American War, fueled by the same desire for land, not only brought the U.S. a massive swath of territory, but also left a legacy of tension and resentment between the U.S. and Mexico. For Mexicans, the war meant the loss of their homeland and, in many cases, their dignity. For those of Mexican descent, the idea of manifest destiny became a nightmare, one that left them on the fringes of American society for generations. And then there were the African Americans who were caught in the crossfire of an expanding nation built on slavery. As the U.S. stretched its borders, the issue of slavery followed close behind, with the institution seeking to expand into new territories. The debate over slavery would tear the nation apart, leading to the Civil War, where hundreds of thousands of lives were lost. African Americans in both the North and South paid a heavy price, whether through the horrors of enslavement or the bloodshed of war. And while people suffered, the land itself also bore the weight of manifest destiny. The environmental destruction was staggering. The once vibrant plains teeming with buffalo and native wildlife were turned into barren farmlands. Forests were felled, rivers dammed, and the delicate balance of ecosystems was forever disrupted. The Transcontinental Railroad, which symbolized American progress, cut through mountains and valleys, bringing with it both industry and environmental degradation. Manifest destiny led to the transformation of a young nation into a continental power, but it came at the expense of countless lives, cultures, and the environment. These scars are not just remnants of history. They are part of the very fabric of the America we live in today. So, as we reflect on the legacy of manifest destiny, we must ask ourselves, what kind of future are we building? Are we still driven by the same forces of expansion, domination, and exceptionalism? Or have we learned the lessons of the past, acknowledging the cost of progress, and striving for a future that honors justice, equality, and respect for all people? The history of manifest destiny is a reminder that the dreams of a nation can come at a terrible price. The question is, whose dreams are we building today? Whose future are we shaping? As we move forward, it's up to us to decide what kind of country we want to be, and whether we will be the nation that lives up to its highest ideals or one that repeats the mistakes of the past. Manifest destiny wasn't just a chapter in American history. It was a force that shaped the world we live in today. From the expansion of U.S. borders to the lasting effects on Native communities, the environment, and even global politics, its impact still resonates. But the real question is, how much of its legacy do you still see today? As we continue to confront issues of land rights, racial justice, and American exceptionalism, we have to ask, what lessons can we learn from the past, and how do they shape the way we act now? The future of America is still being written, and your voice can help shape the story. So, what do you think? Is the legacy of manifest destiny still influencing the way we approach the world today? How do its ideas impact modern America, both domestically and globally? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, because your perspective matters, and it's time we all reflect on what kind of future we want to build. This conversation isn't over. The future is ours to shape. So let's discuss how we can learn from the past and build a better tomorrow. Drop your thoughts below, and let's keep this important dialogue going.